But anyway, on a serious note, I want you to go to 2 Corinthians chapter number 10, 2 Corinthians chapter number 10. And we're all on a pilgrimage, we're all on a journey. And God certainly is doing something in my heart, and certainly we're all on a journey. But God did something in the month of May that set me on a little bit of a journey that I've continued to be on from time to time. For almost 35 years now, I've had the privilege of being a large part of my meetings, over 50%, would be teen-oriented. So working with young people, you begin to kind of see trends. You begin to see things that certainly burden you, and over the years, certain things have stuck out to me, and recently I think some of those things have begun to kind of put together. And I'll try to explain where I'm going here in just a moment. But let me just tell you, in the month of May, I was with a dear pastor in a smaller church, and he's kind of in what you would call a more difficult area, but he's doing a great job. Actually, his church would be one of the larger Baptist churches in that area. It's not in our country. It's in the north of the border. And we started meeting there, and he said, now, Brother Van Gelderen, he said, I had something happen a few weeks ago. He said, I want to tell you about it and tell you what God's doing. He said, I was just preaching, he said, and I think it was either in Titus or Timothy, one of the Timothys, and I came across the word sober-minded, and he said, I just spent about 5 minutes exhorting our men in the area of pornography. He said, I haven't really preached on it. He said, I just dealt with it. He said, what stunned me was the response. He had said, I had 5 of my young men, some married, some single, come to me and indicate that that was a major problem in their life. And he said, it absolutely floored me. And he said, I really didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help them. He said, I really didn't know what to do. So he said, what I did was, he said, I began searching the internet for some Bible, somebody who has done some work on this that I could glean from their work in the Word of God and to be a help. And he said, I came across a video series. He told me what the series was. He said, I want you to watch that series with me. And I just want you to, any thoughts you have on it, because it didn't come from our realm, and it was a broader evangelical realm. And so I said, sure, I'd love to see it. I really would. Of course, working with young people, that's an issue that we face on a regular basis. And so I sat down, watched that thing, and I will tell you, it was one of those life-altering moments. It was about 6+ hours of videos, and we watched them. You're supposed to watch them over a series of like 13 weeks, and we watched them in like just hours. But in there's some sense, it really was helpful. Now, it really opened my eyes to this. In fact, they did a survey of evangelical churches. Now, this is broader than I'm comfortable with, but they did a survey of evangelical churches. Here's what they found. 70% of the men in our pulpit, in our pews, are presently struggling with pornography or have had a serious battle in the past. Most of them, it's present tense. Not only that, 58% of our pastors are actively in pornography. 58%. Now, this is broader than I'm comfortable with. And you know what I said to myself? Boy, I sure hope the independent Baptists are better than that. But you know, I began to wonder, maybe we're not. Maybe it's a bigger problem than I realize. And let me just simply say that mentioning the issue of pornography is one of those issues that's uncomfortable. I get that. I grew up in a home where, a very guarded home, very much of a greenhouse. And I went to Chicago Public Schools, and that's where I learned teen culture, even though they weren't teenagers, certainly. Some of the most wicked people I've ever met were elementary school kids. And that's where I got my education on the depravity of man. I say that in all seriousness. I preach to teenagers every week, and I still glean from my first grade classmates on the sins that public school kids do, because it was just a very wicked place. But as a result of being in a sheltered home, even though I had some exposure to the public school, sometimes you assume things that are not true. You sometimes assume every home's like my home, which is not true. And I began to realize, get on a journey this summer, really studying, and I began to think about just a few things, okay, about this. How about this one? I'm going to kind of seem like I can go in a different direction, but really not. A couple of years ago, I was talking with somebody who was more in the know than I would be, and they said, began to name me Bible colleges that we're all familiar with, and I'm not going to name them, that are what we call independent Baptist Bible colleges. They would certainly be a pretty broad spectrum, but they'd all be in the independent Baptist movement. And they said, this preacher boy class is down, this preacher boy class is down, this preacher boy class is down, this preacher. And basically said across the independent Baptist movement, almost every preacher boy class is significantly down in number. Now, Baptist College of Ministry is even, but we're a smaller school, and we're probably for the last 5-6 years pretty much been the same size. Okay, so we're tabled. But the other ones have largely begun to drop some, and I began to think about that. Why? Oh, I know why. Because God's calling less young men to preach, right? Thought that would be a good solution, right? God's just calling less, so that's why the preacher boys' classes are dropping, because the need's being met, and we just don't need. We got too many preachers, and we can't put them in enough places. I mean, we got not enough places to put them. So you think that might be the solution? Why? No, we all know that's not the solution. I'm speaking as a fool, as Paul would say. Well, then what's the problem? Well, the problem is, obviously God's calling young men. Now, the truth is, I think in many cases they know God's calling them. I think in many cases the reason they're not responding is because they are deeply defeated. Even at a school like Baptist College of Ministry, which is a very conservative school and draws a very conservative constituency and to draw kids from very conservative homes, our dean of men would tell you that a large portion of the young men who step on that campus have had significant failure in the area of viewing filth, even at a school like ours. You know what that tells me? It's a big problem. It's a huge problem. So I began to get on this journey. What are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? Because we need to see victory. Now, thank the Lord. One of the reasons our dean of men knows these kind of statistics is because the young men get right with God their freshman, sophomore year. They confess their sin. They get right with their parents. And in fact, I'd say most of them are an unbelievable victory they never thought possible. And, of course, are excited about the ministry, and many of them God's just using in a remarkable way, which is really encouraging. That their success rate has just been stunning and encouraging. Of course, revival truth's all a part of that. But he began to get on a journey, okay, maybe this is why. You know, we're in a large church, and, man, a lot of people are growing, a lot of people, God's working. But, you know, there's some people, I come back to my church and say, why don't they grow? Why don't they grow? They never grow. They never grow. They just sit there on Sunday morning like deadheads, and, I wonder there's a deeper issue. There's something they're not overcoming in their life. Now, when we think of pornography, let me just simply say, the message is going to be bigger than that. I would call pornography a coping mechanism. There are more respectable coping mechanisms, which I'll deal with in a moment. But here's my contention. I've thought to myself, God has really been working. Thank the Lord for the revival movement. But there's sometimes I think to myself, why aren't we farther than I think we should be? And then it will hit me. Or it hit me this summer. Maybe there's some deeper issues that are not being resolved. Sin issues. Now, let me just keep it simple to you, because I really do believe this, that if I come into a Christian school and there is a deadness and you're preaching and there's resistance, let me just simply say it's really not rocket science. The problem is the three-letter word. It's sin. It's always sin. It's always sin. But that's the issue anywhere. In fact, the Bible says in the book of Matthew 24 and verse 12, and because iniquity shall abound, do you know the rest of the verse? The love of many shall wax cold. And I found this to be so true in working with teenagers. You show me a cold teenager, the colder a teenager is, the more wicked stuff he's involved in. In other words, it just goes backwards. In fact, I remember years ago seeing a young man absolutely on fire for God, called to preach, soul winning, the whole mess. I mean, just into it. I mean, just living for the Lord. And then it was like he went, it seemed like weeks, maybe even days, just dropped off a cliff. And I remember saying to somebody, that kid's not just in sin, that kid's in big sin, deep sin. And I remember kind of people looking at me like, no, I don't think so. I was convinced. You know why? Because I believe the Bible. I'm not trying to be, it's true. Because iniquity shall abound, the love of men. When it came out, that guy was in pretty bad stuff. But the point is why? Because that's what iniquity does. So what I want us to do here is I want us to do a little investigation. I'm going to use 2 Corinthians 10, and I will say this will be a multi-message series. As an evangelist, I don't do a lot of series, but I have been on this journey, so it's going to take a little bit more than one message, but we'll probably tonight continue to develop this. But I want us to begin looking at verse number 3. Let's begin with verse 3 of 2 Corinthians 10. It says, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, they're not fleshly, but mighty through God to the pulling down of, here's the key word, strongholds. Casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalted itself against the knowledge of God. Now I want us to stop here, and I want us to talk a little bit about strongholds, because I believe this is the Bible word for what we're talking about. When I got on this journey this summer, I did some reading on this particular issue, the issue of, particularly of the issue of pornography and some of the things from a biblical perspective. Came across one book that was so helpful. It dealt with the 4 stages. It dealt with the fact that you've got to have an addictive root, then you go to addictive mindset, an addictive lifestyle, and then you go to the addictive cloak. Now think about this. And when we think of addictions, I want to just clear things up here. I certainly am including alcohol, drugs, pornography, but I'm also including respectable addictions. Respectable addictions might be, and these aren't respectable in some people's thinking, but the culture would look at them respectable. How about this? Video games. A few weeks ago, I was preaching in a church. A kid was falling asleep during the message, and afterwards, one of my team members walked up to him and said, "Hey, you stayed up to 2 o'clock doing video games, didn't you?" Kid looked at him like in total shock, like, "How did you know?" Well, he knew because that's what he used to do. Listen, you see a teenager falling asleep in your service, I guarantee it's many times either social media or video games or worse, they're staying up late on the internet. It's technology. It's addictive. The point is they can't even stop. I have a little video. I don't have time here to show it. Actually, I could pull out my computer, but there's a video done a few years ago called "The Video That Broke the Internet." It has 250 million views. A guy named Simon Sinek, some of you may have heard of him. He's a very interesting speaker, not a Christian by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the subject matters he deals with is the millennial generation. Anybody familiar with what I'm talking about here? Anybody? Okay. He did this little video on millennials, and he basically said the millennials, he said a room was full of millennials, and of course he had them laughing because he was describing them to a T. And he said one of the great dangers is social media. He said, because what some of you do, you millennials do, you're kind of got some problems, life's precedent on you, you're not fulfilled, and you'll send out 10 texts. And every time you get an answer back, and everybody starts laughing, kind of like, "How did you know?" He said, then every time you get an answer back, you get a hit of dopamine. He said, the problem is, he said, the people investigating, sociologists I guess would say, is that we're raising a generation that has become addicted to dopamine, but they don't even realize it that way. He said dopamine is the same thing that happens when people get drunk, when people use drugs, when people use pornography. They get hits of dopamine. He said what social media does, and again, I realize that social media can be used in a proper way, but I'm dealing with now the negative way, and we all know that it is it's a generational thing. But he's talked about the fact that many young people cope with the pressures of life with, this is an unsaved man, using social media. And he said the problem is, the younger a person experiences excessive hits of dopamine, the more likely they are in life to be an addict. He said a kid who turns to alcohol at 16 is far more likely to be an alcoholic than someone turns to it later in life. Isn't that interesting? Someone who turns to drugs, illegal drugs in their teenage years, is far more likely to be an addict than someone who turns to it later in life. Same thing with pornography, etc. There's far more likelihood for there to be an addict. And this guy was simply saying, he said, the problem is we're raising a generation whose coping mechanisms is social media. Do you think kids are addicted to technology? See, it's a coping mechanism. The point is, these are things that people turn to try to give fulfillment and satisfaction. So I wanted to find a passage of Scripture that will help us with this, because I really want us to investigate it, because I've thought to myself, again, why isn't that we're not moving forward faster? Why do some people just seem to hit a ceiling? Why do some of us just hit a ceiling? We just can't seem to break through to the next level of Christian growth. Why? And my contention to you all is perhaps it's because there's a stronghold. There's a wrong coping mechanism in life. You're turning to the wrong things to meet your need. And we heard a moment ago a message on turning to the right thing. Okay, we understand that. Now, why don't we turn to the right thing? Well, let's look at the passage. Look what it says here, pulling down of strongholds. Now, there's two aspects in verse number 5. It says, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God. There are two things that God says make up a stronghold. Now, a stronghold in its literal sense would be like a castle. It'd be a military fortification. All of us perhaps would think in our minds a medieval castle, and we'd be pretty close to understanding what a stronghold is, at least literally. But the point with this stronghold, this is a stronghold that is in our own hearts. Now, what I want us to do, and there's so many things going through my mind here, but what I want us to do is to investigate what the stronghold is. This message is diagnostic. We're not going to talk about how to get rid of the stronghold. We just want to diagnose them right now, diagnostic, where you walk out and say, yeah, I do have a stronghold. Now, obviously, the stronghold has to be built on a piece of real estate. Now, can you imagine if we found that some Muslim terrorists, known terrorist organization, had bought land here in Michigan and they were actively building a military fortification? Would that be a problem to Michiganders? And the answer is, it'd be a huge problem. You're thinking, they can't do this. Now, we all know there's sleeper cells. People are doing that. But as far as we know in the United States, there's nothing that's out there where everybody knows they're building a military fortification. That seems unthinkable. And yet Satan builds, if we could say, strongholds in our own minds and our hearts. And how does he do it? Now, don't miss this. He does it with real estate we give him, and he does it with building materials that we give him. In order for a stronghold to be built, you must give the devil real estate, and you must give the devil building materials. Now, where does the real estate come from? Okay, the real estate, the Bible tells us where the real estate comes from. In Ephesians chapter 4, don't turn for time, it says, neither give place to the devil. The word place is the word topos. We get the word topography from it. So you say, well, preacher, how do you give place to the devil? How do you give topography to the devil? It's real simple. The passage tells us how. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath. So what if the sun does go down upon your wrath? You just gave Satan real estate. Every time you and I hold on to lingering resentments, anger, hatred, or bitterness, you give the devil real estate. Are there people today who sit on our pews every Sunday who have a low-grade resentment toward their marriage partner? And the answer is, they are giving Satan real estate. It happens all the time. Are there people who have unresolved bitternesses and anger toward perhaps dysfunctional homes that they now are no longer in? Do we have people like that in our pews? And the answer is, you better believe it. They have given Satan topography. You and I give Satan topography simply when you do not resolve wrath. You let the sun go down upon your wrath. God says, basically, could we say this? You got 24 hours to deal with it. God says, you better deal with it and deal with it quick, because if you don't, the devil now has some real estate, and he's going to build a stronghold on it. And you will give him the building materials. So the bottom line then, the topography comes from unresolved resentment. I'm going to use the word resentment because the word bitterness is a word we don't like. It's like people. I remember one lady years ago, when I was a young preacher, came up to me and said, preacher, for years I would say, I'm not bitter. I'm just hurt. Nobody likes the word bitterness, so I try to use different words to help us understand resentment, that low-grade resentment. My wife, things would be better if she wouldn't just do fill in the blank. Or whatever. Could be my husband if he would just get with the whatever. Blame and resentment. And we give Satan topography. Okay, so the issue there is really that becomes the root. Okay, you have an addictive root. You have an addictive mindset. That's what causes there to then go to an addictive lifestyle. The addictive mindset is wrong thinking, which brings us to the very first word. It says casting down imaginations. The word imagination is the word logikos. Some of you know this is the word we get logical from. I like what one definition of this particular word was. Illogical logic. Hyper-Calvinism, you know what it is? Illogical logic. Oh, it's logical, all right. It's just illogical if you take the Bible into account. See, the point is, people have reasoning. People can tell you why they do certain things. But if it's faulty reasoning, the idea of imaginations, it's reasoning, but it's faulty reasoning. It's like this. Many times, a son or daughter will hear these words from an angry father. You can't do anything right. And they believe it. And it sets them on a pathway of having a stronghold. They have a low-grade resentment toward their father, and Satan begins to build a stronghold. You can't do anything right. You can't. You're worthless. You don't have much value in this life. I will tell you, probably over 50% of the teenagers I preach to and deal with have this problem in their life. They have a bitterness toward an angry father or a father that was absent in their life. And as a result of that, a stronghold from his words are being built in their hearts. I can't do anything right. Now, I'm just going to tell you, this is not a small problem. this is a huge problem. The number one problem I deal with every week in a Christian school is bitterness, by far. Moral purity is close second. But bitterness is the big one. I think moral purity is only a close second because not everybody's honest. I think it would be far closer to even if they were more honest. They're much more willing to be honest about bitterness than moral impurity issues. But the point is, I found in the 35 years of ministry, the major focus of bitterness is toward fathers. When I watched this video series, this guy who did the video series basically said this. He's dealt with thousands of sexual addicts, and here's what he says. In almost every one of the sexual addicts he deals with, he finds they have major father wounds in their soul. Now that's stunning. Father wounds. Now again, it's hard for me to totally comprehend because I don't have father wounds. My dad wasn't perfect, but I don't have any father wounds. But I've worked with enough kids, I know a lot of people do, and I'm telling you, a lot of our Christian kids have father wounds. Father wounds come from two kinds of fathers. Number one, the absent father. The absent father is a good man, many times a good man, but he does not engage his kids in a father-child relationship. Years ago, I was preaching in a western state. When I was done, I sat down. It was Sunday school hour, and the pastor got up. He's older than I was. He's weeping, silently, kind of quietly weeping. And he says, folks, he said, I realized something in Sunday school I have never realized in my entire life until now. He said, I've been bitter at my father. He said, my father was a good man. He'd work hard, provided everything I need. But when he came home from work, he'd sit down in front of the television set and he'd grab his newspaper. Wow, is this not 1960s, 1970s dads? Never took me fishing, never did anything, father-son relationship. He said, for years, I've realized I've had a bitterness toward my father because he never really fathered me. That's the passive father. Or the absent father. The absent father could be in the home. It just means he's absent when it comes to fathering. The absent father, of course, in other cases, isn't even there. It's like the kid sobbing, tells one of my team members, I hate my dad. I hate my dad. I've never met my dad. I don't know where he is. I've never talked to my dad. Never texted my dad. He doesn't even know where his dad is, and he hates his dad. Yeah, wow, that's kind of hard, isn't it? I never thought you could hate somebody you never met, but I was wrong. I work with kids who hate their dads because their dad walked out of their life. Those are father wounds. The man who did this pornography series had 7 stepfathers. And he had all kinds of father wounds. And it spiraled him into all kinds of sexual addictions. And of course, it took him 5 years to get free. 5 years. 5 years. And of course, that's why I did the video series, to try to help other men along the pathway that he had. It's a very interesting series. But anyway, that's not my point. My point is for us to investigate this. We're trying to be diagnostic right now. But so wrong thinking. See, I forgot the angry father. That's the other thing. The angry father is the father who's got an anger problem, and he says things that are hurtful. I had a student at our college come up to me and said, Brother Van Gelderen, he said, years ago, said some hurtful things were said to me. And I don't know who it was. It could have been a father. It could not have been. I don't know. But he said, I really did forgive the person, and I got victory over bitterness. But as a result of the message tonight, I realized something I never realized. That although I forgave that person for hurting me, I believed what they said. And he said, I realized tonight what they said was a lie. Now think about this. When a father says to a son or daughter, you can't do anything right, you know what I have to say? Because this is being recorded, I've got to say this. That is a lie. Because the Bible says I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. So who are you going to believe, an angry father or a loving heavenly father? See, the truth is illogical logic. It's faulty reasoning. It's people who've heard things said, people who've been treated perhaps like they weren't important, and fathers and mothers can do this, particularly in dysfunctional homes, even sometimes Christian homes, perhaps because that's the home they grew up in and they never learned to get grace, to get victory over this. And as a result of this, they bring wounds into their kids. And sometimes I'm thinking of one dear father who came from a very difficult situation. And when his kids began to struggle, he was shocked because he thought, my father left me, I'm here. But the point is, he's there, but he's not engaging his kids. He was a passive father and didn't realize it because he never had a father. He didn't know how to be a father. And so certainly these are issues, but they're illogical logic. There's faulty reasoning, things said or things that are done, and they're brought into the heart, and people they embrace them. And then if there's that resentment or that bitterness or that anger, you've given Satan real estate, and now you're handing him bricks. And here's what happens every time you think, I'm worthless, man. I can't do anything for God. You just handed the devil a brick. Or how about this one? God may love others, but he certainly doesn't love me. Do you know you hand the devil a brick? Gave him because of bitterness or resentment, and he begins to build a stronghold of wrong thinking, and that stronghold is why you hit a ceiling and you can't break through in your Christian life. You hear some of the greatest preaching that you could ever hear about revival, and you can't break into it. Why? Because the devil's got a military installation on your soil of your heart, and he is absolutely keeping you back from breaking through. The only way, and we're going to talk about it tonight, the stronghold's got to come down. So there's faulty reasonings, and I feel like when I begin on this, that literally I could bring 2 or 3 messages just on faulty reasonings, the applications, that is. But in order for time's sake, we got to look at the other one. It says, and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God. This is unbelievable. Brother Miller already touched on this, but this is unbelievable. What is a high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God? Well, you first of all have got to understand what the knowledge of God is. And I think at first glance, many of us assume it means knowledge about God. But it is not talking about knowledge about God. It is talking about knowing him relationally. According to the treasury of New Testament synonyms, simply the word gnosis here, comes from gnosko, is knowledge, don't miss this, gained by experience. Experiential knowledge. Now, the governor of the state of Wisconsin, or just about to be the former governor, Scott Walker, and we're all bumming out about that, but the former governor of the state of Wisconsin, I have met a couple of times. I've been to the governor's mansion just a couple of times. He's had many of our choirs and orchestras over there, and once or twice a year, and I've just met him a couple times in passing. I really don't know Scott Walker. I mean, I've heard him pray with our kids, and I would say he certainly exhibits the fact he's a believer. He's a Baptist preacher for a dad, and he certainly there's certain things I know about him, but I really don't know him. I don't know how he reacts in certain situations. I don't know if he's high-strung, low-strung. I don't know I don't know him. I really don't know him. I know a little bit about him, but I don't really know Scott Walker. Now, my nephew Daniel has been to the governor's mansion multiple times. He knows Scott Walker way better than I do. He's talked to him, he's communicated with him, and he knows Scott Walker a whole lot better than I do, but I guarantee you that Daniel does not know Scott Walker like Mrs. Walker does. Mrs. Walker knows Scott Walker. She knows what discourages him, what encourages him. She knows things about him that nobody else on planet Earth knows. Why? She's gained it by experience of probably 30-plus years living with the guy. You understand that? Okay, that's what knowledge does, gained by experience. So when God says, high things that exalt themselves against the knowledge of God, friends, I don't want you to miss this. The highest level, and this is what Brother Miller, I believe, was trying to say, of the Christian life is knowing God experientially. That's what I believe the songwriter said when he said, he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. Do you know what the songwriter is talking about? I have heard that song thrown into the bus more than almost any other hymn. It's just people thrown into the bus like, what? I'm thinking to myself, man, I feel so sorry for them. That's where my grandmother lived. She walked and talked with Jesus all the time. I'm thinking, man, if they think that's hymn's unscriptural, I think they're missing something about the Christian life. Certainly that my grandmother knew, that I'm certainly pursuing. But the point, friends, is simply this. That's what I believe the songwriter is talking about. He's talking about an experiential knowledge that comes because you are walking with God. And I believe with all my heart, the ultimate of the Christian life experience, the ultimate of human existence, is fellowshipping with God. There is nothing more satisfying, fulfilling, and nothing more powerful than when God pulls back the veil and you experience his presence. There's something about the manifest presence of God. And I will tell you, when God shows up in a life, you will never be the same. You will never be the same. And everybody, we don't talk about it a lot because many times, I'll tell you why, because those moments are so sacred we can hardly ever want to talk about them. They are so sacred. And yet, it's like one Bible college student there at Baptist College of Ministry said, and he's a humble guy. And so you might sound like it's not humble, but it was a very humble statement. He got up at the end of last school year and he said this. He said, last year I gave a testimony about my freshman year. He said, I gave a testimony that I had met with Jesus. He said, I can honestly say this year I have walked with Jesus. And everybody knows him, knows he's telling you the truth. That guy walks with God. You know what that means? Every day. Every day he's walking with God, knowing the reality of the presence of God in his life. And everybody would tell you he's a quiet kid, wouldn't look like he has a huge skill set. But he has real influence in the college. You know why? Because he walks with God. But he knows he's the real deal. He's humble. The point, friends, is simply this. That's what we're talking about. So what is this? It's like this. What's a high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God? A high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God is anything you and I turn to find fulfillment, satisfaction, and coping other than God. See, what I'm trying to get at is this. Christians turn to the wrong coping mechanisms. Now, I talked about that addictive root, the addictive lifestyle, the addictive mindset, the addictive lifestyle, and the addictive cloak. And I will talk about this again and again, so pardon the repetition. But the addictive root, could be several addictive roots, but the big one often is, hang on, wounds. Unhealed wounds. And you know what unhealed wounds turn into? A root of bitterness. Then they go, obviously, to an addictive mindset, which goes to an addictive lifestyle. In other words, like this. When there is pain in someone's life, they want to medicate it. How many out here on a regular basis get headaches? Oh, man, alive. Oh, got a few. Okay, get a minute. I'm not constant, but periodic headaches. I carry extra strength Excedrin with me like nobody's business. Because I'll be honest with you, there's times I could not preach if I did not medicate the pain. I got to medicate the pain. I've got a caffeine high. I mean, I'm like this, but hey, it's better than pain. You know what I'm talking about? You medicate pain. We do that in this culture. Have you ever noticed that also that sometimes if something causes you pain, you get angry toward? Have you ever? How many out here would admit that you have at least once in your life bumped your head on the cabinets? Now, don't raise your hand on the next one. How many would admit your first anger was to destroy the cabinets? You know what I'm talking about? Stupid cabinet, you know. Well, it wasn't the cabinet. It was you. It was me. And I'll bang my head on the cabinet, then I'm all upset at the cabinets. Dumb cabinets. I got to rip you off the wall and destroy you. And that's what you wanted to do until, calmer thoughts persuaded you not to do that. Hurting people, anybody know? Hurt people. So you know what pain causes you to do, don't you? Immediately react to the person who caused you pain. If somebody walked up to you and slugged some of you in the face, particularly you men, because you've got that masculinity, that testosterone in your bloodstream, the very first thing you want to do is haul back and nail them back. Why? Because when someone causes us pain, we immediately turn toward the thing that's hurt us. So there's a couple of thoughts in here, friends. That's why many times you see what happens to people who are bitter. They defile others with their bitterness and anger. They wrong other people. Plus the fact they then turn, not only they wrong other people, they have got to medicate the pain. And so what do people do? Turn to coping mechanisms. Well, I've already mentioned a lot of the coping. I'm going to give you a few more because overworking. Here's a guy who comes into a relationship. He's got pain from his youth. And you know what often happens with people who have wounds and people who've been hurt by other people? They put their hands up like this and said, don't get too close because I don't want anybody else hurting me. This happens all the time with teenagers. Don't get too close. Don't get close. I don't want you hurting me. Now, when you bring that into marriage, guess what? You've got a problem. A lot of marriages start like this. Because there's hurt, they don't want to be re-hurt. And then what happens is the wife doesn't understand, she's confused, and so there begins to be now reciprocal hurt. So the hurt cycle continues on. And then what happens? Both of them look for something to medicate the pain. So here's some of them. Overworking. You ever seen a dad? Unearthly hours at the office. Comes home and the wife just explodes. What's he doing? That's his coping mechanism. overworking. You know, one of the reasons why? Because it's respectable. It's respectable in man's eyes. It is not respectable in God's eyes. I'll talk about that later. But nonetheless, how about this one? Hey, I hit the men, I got to hit the dear ladies. But some ladies spend money out shopping for one reason, they want the hit of dopamine. Are there people who spend money they don't have? Does that happen? Yeah. Puts them in financial trouble? Why? They're looking for they're coping mechanisms. Shopping to get that hit of dopamine. And a lady will tell you they feel good when they buy something new. They like it. I mean, it feels good. But if you don't have the money, it doesn't work. It happens to guys, too. You ever heard about the young husband who comes home on a Harley? He just bought, and they can barely make house payments? Oh, but honey, it's only $100 more a month. And the marriage starts to disintegrate. What's happening there? The guy's looking to a coping mechanism, and the coping mechanism in that case was Harley. Money they didn't have. Spending money you don't have. Of course, what teenagers already mentioned, video games, technology, social media, all these things people turn to because there's a dopamine hit. It's a coping mechanism. The only problem is, if it's not legitimate, when the dopamine wears off, you feel worse about everything than you did before you used the coping mechanism. So could I say this carefully? The greatest coping mechanism in all the world, and I am not trying to be irreverent, please understand this. The greatest coping mechanism in all the world is Jesus Christ. In fact, he's really the only coping mechanism. Now, don't miss this. Every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. So it's like this. Anything you and I turn to, other than an experiential relationship with Jesus, that we turn to bring fulfillment or satisfaction in life, some people turn to Fox News. I'm not saying it's wrong to watch some of these things in and of themselves. It's not wrong to shop. It's not wrong to buy things in the will of God. We all understand that. But what I'm talking about is those things that we turn to something looking for fulfillment, and God is simply saying that's a high thing that you've exalted above the knowledge of God. The ultimate of the human experience is experientially knowing God, and anything you turn to other than that is ridiculous. But God says you have exalted something that has no right to be exalted, but you have exalted it above knowing God, which is foolish beyond compare. Now, friends, I want to ask you this. When you lack fulfillment in life, when you're really not satisfied with things that are going on, what do you turn to? Because that's your stronghold. The point I believe is many believers have strongholds. Because there's unresolved anger, resentment, whatever you want to call. You've given Satan real estate. You have wrong thinking patterns. That's the addictive mindset. Wrong thinking, and the devil's great to take those wrong thoughts, and he starts building. And I know how it is. And he's glad to take it, and he just builds. Generational issue of strongholds. You know what it is? It's God. I think about my father. I think my dad was a great dad. I'm telling you, my dad's been gone 21 years. I love my dad. If I start talking about too much, I will cry. 21 years, I love my dad. He was a tremendous father. And the amazing thing is, his dad wasn't spiritual at all. His dad was a very carnal man. Not that he was in wicked sin, but he had no real thinking. We hope he's in heaven. But he had no understanding of spiritual things. Now, my grandmother did. She walked with God like nobody's business. In fact, my grandmother left the church because the pastor said he'd believed that Jesus Christ was the son of a German soldier, which, by the way, was a Southern Baptist church. Not to tell you that there were issues back in the day Jesus Christ was the son of a German soldier. And you know what my grandmother did? She was asked the pastor, what do you believe about the virgin birth? Turned, did not speak another word, walked out of that church and never came back. And my grandfather was upset. But my point simply is this. My grandfather was not a spiritual man. He was a good man. He didn't yell at the kids. He wasn't angry. But he wasn't a spiritual man at all. So I'm thinking to myself, how did my dad become such a phenomenal dad? And there's only one answer. Jesus Christ. My mother was an orphan. I love my mother. My mother was an outstanding mother. I still see those brown eyes. She went to heaven in 1989, almost 30 years ago. I can still see those brown eyes on fire, looking at me and say, Jim, don't you dare do that. It's still in my heart. She said, now, Jim, when you go to Bob Jones, I want you to know, Jim, we will take the side of the school. Novel concept, isn't it? I never thought about calling home and said, hey, you're not going to believe what the school did to me. I thought they'll take their side. I'm not even, why even try, But I could still see those fire. And my mother loved me. I knew she never doubted she loved me. But boy, the fire would be in her eyes. She was an orphan. Her parents were not even sure we're saved. I hope they are. So how did she learn to be such a good mother? It's called Jesus Christ. You know what I'm talking about? My point, friends, is simply saying this. The ultimate coping mechanism is the Lord Jesus. It's knowing Him, walking with Him. And tonight, I want us to deal with how do we I won't probably be able to deal with casting down imaginations. I may have to deal with another message. But tonight, I want us to deal with how do you cast down high things that are exalted against the knowledge of God? Because here's the point. We have a lot of coping mechanisms. Some of them are respectable. Hey, how many of our teenage kids, you go in the average Christian school, and many of them don't allow them to have smartphones during school hours, which is a good thing. But after school or at the war or whenever they're coming, what do you see them? They're addicted to their screen. You ever seen a teenager addicted to their screen who claims to be saved? What's the problem? The problem is they are not, I guarantee in most of the cases, they're not finding fulfillment and satisfaction in Jesus Christ. It's in their phone. It's a high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. Hey, a lot of Christians today, hey, listen, may I say something else? I'll probably hit this tonight. What about Netflix Christianity? Netflix Christianity is killing us. It's killing us. We got preacher boys watch a movie a week. Now, I guarantee you, you watch a movie a week, you're going to run out of the ones that probably meet qualifications of Scripture pretty fast. And pretty soon you're going to watch stuff that grieves the Holy Spirit. But why do people think Hollywood can bring meaning to life? Listen, there are Christian families all across this country probably listening to me right now that I guarantee you watch a movie a week, and I can guarantee you they have a high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. That is more important to them than walking with God. And may I say this? It's killing us. We wonder why we don't have revival. I'll tell you why I don't have revival. We are looking to something other than Jesus to really meet our needs. The experiential knowledge of walking with God. That's what I want to talk about. Experientially knowing Jesus. I'm talking tonight about the experience. I know it's a word we sometimes get nervous about, and it should because there are deceptive experiences. So maybe a better word would be talking about the spiritual reality of walking with Jesus. Maybe that's a better way to put it. But my grandmother walked with Jesus. And her experience, you could observe. When she prayed, she ushered you into the presence of God, and you knew you were there. My grandmother could not talk to Jesus without crying. She had an unbelievable walk with God. I stop at her grave there in Winter Garden, Florida all the time when I can. Because I wouldn't be here without that woman. Just a simple Alabama cotton-picking girl who just decided to believe God. And she began to know Jesus. And I'll probably talk more about her testimony tonight. Every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. So the diagnosis. Perhaps I'll leave some of the other message here to later tonight. But I want to be on the series. And the series is really this, friends. Are we really willing to ask God, what are the wrong thinkings, the faulty reasonings, the illogical logic that we bought into? And what is that? Where have we allowed there to be anger, sun that's gone down upon our wrath, and we've allowed Satan to take some real estate and we keep handing him bricks? What are those wrong thinking processes? And then what are those high things that exalt themselves against the knowledge of God? Maybe I'll conclude with this. A couple of years ago, we had a couple of brothers come into our college. They both had basically told their dad, yeah, we'll go for 1 year. Because your dad said, I want you to go for 1 year. They didn't want to come. But they were good enough boys, loved their dad, had a good relationship with their dad. They said, Dad, we'll come. But in both of their cases, I remember, I walked in, I'm usually gone, come right in before the school, and I remember a couple of people came to me and say, hey, we got these brothers here, and one of them wants to be a cop, and another one of them wants to be involved in politics. Not that those things are wrong. Those things aren't wrong. But it could tell very clearly that those two things, the things that they had, their careers, were their choice, what they wanted to do. And I don't know how to explain it. And I think in my heart said, well, let's wait to see what God can do. And in both of those young men cases, some of the people in this room know who I'm talking about. When those brothers, was within weeks, they broke and surrendered themselves to do whatever God wanted them to do. And you know what happened in both their lives? They have turned into, I believe, very promising young preachers. And I believe God's hand's all over their life. What had happened is they had to get rid of the high things. They had to get rid of what they wanted to do with their life, the things that they thought would bring fulfillment, and surrender and say, God, if you want me to preach, I'll do it. And now both of them would tell you, God, they have completely lost their vision for the things they thought they were going to love beforehand. And not to say that some people are called to those things, and that's not wrong if they are. But in their cases, I think everyone knew, no, that's not what they're called to do. Sometimes the Spirit of God just puts that in your heart. My friend, what are your coping mechanisms? What is it you're looking for fulfillment and satisfaction in life? Because those high things are strongholds. So we're in the diagnostic. Let me encourage you, if you don't want to just stand to your feet, let's just do that. Stand to your feet, heads are bowed, eyes are closed. Heads are bowed, eyes are closed. Standing to our feet, here's what we're going to do. Just going to be in the quiet of the moment. We've already done an invitation like this, but has God identified a stronghold in your life? Something in your life, you say, preacher, there's something that I turn to is more important to me. Sometimes it's sports. Nothing wrong with watching sports, but some people find fulfillment and satisfaction from that and not from walking with God. And all I'm going to just simply say in these moments, quiet of the moment, we'll just, since we don't have pianists, we'll just keep it quiet. And if God has identified a stronghold in your own life, wrong thinking, or something you turn to other than God to bring fulfillment and satisfaction in life, I'm just going to invite you to sit for a moment and at least say, God, you've diagnosed a problem in my life. And I want to acknowledge it. I want to agree with you, as we heard preached a few moments ago. Just go ahead and take a seat. Coping mechanisms.